Hello, boring dreamers. Today we retrading the gilded cages of ancient Egypt for the muddy fields of the European Middle Ages, roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries. Forget the shining armor and the romanticized feasts. We're diving into the brutal truth about medieval daily life that the movies always leave out. Close your eyes and step through the rough wooden gate of a small 14th century village. The first thing that hits you is not the sight of the thatched roofs or the smoke from the chimneys, but the constant, all-pervading stench. This is the fundamental, inescapable reality of your life. The air is a thick, nauseating mix that never truly dissipates. You breathe a blend of unwashed bodies, stale wood smoke, animal manure from the ubiquitous livestock, and most aggressively, human waste. There are no sewers or organized sanitation systems here. Waste is tossed directly into the nearest stream, down a hole in the street, or simply piled up outside your door. The rain doesn't wash it away. It just spreads the odor. If you are in a city, the stench is compounded by the noxious fumes of various trades. Tanneries boiling urine and animal hides, slaughterhouses spilling guts into the gutters, and blacksmiths burning cheap coal. This overwhelming smell is not just unpleasant, it is lethal. You breathe in pathogens, and your immune system is in a constant, low-grade battle against the filth that surrounds you. The stench is the smell of disease waiting to happen. If you were suddenly transported here from your clean, modern home, the sheer microbial load of the air alone would probably give you a serious infection. You probably won. T survived this for long. The mainstream historical fact is that until the late Renaissance, a core belief was the miasma theory, which held that diseases like the plague and cholera were caused by bad air or poisonous vapors rising from filth. While scientifically incorrect about the cause, its germs obviously, the miasma theorists were right that the foul-smelling areas were indeed where the most people got sick. They identified the problem correctly, even if their solution, carrying fragrant herbs, was laughably ineffective. The sensory assault is total. You walk down the path, and your foot slips in a mixture of mud, rotting vegetable scraps, and dog excrement. You swat at the cloud of flies that congregates persistently around your mouth and eyes. You realize that your nose, which initially rebelled, will soon dull the worst of it simply as a matter of survival. You will learn to ignore the smell of death and decay, which is a terrifying thought. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the attempts to fight the smell among the wealthy. Because they believed odor caused disease, rich nobles would carry pomanders' perforated balls filled with ambergris, musk, or aromatic spices to ward off the bad air. Meanwhile, you, the peasant, just wipe your nose with your hand and get back to work. Which is probably why the rich died less often from the common cold and more often from things like gout. The sheer volume of animals sharing your space contributes massively to the problem. Your family pig might live under the same roof, or in a pen just outside the door. Your chickens roam free, leaving droppings everywhere. The ox that pulls your plow spends the night in a stall built into the end of your house for warmth. The sounds and smells of animal husbandry are constantly interwoven with your family life. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasants suffered more from the physical discomfort of the constant stench or the psychological toll of knowing they lived surrounded by visible, unmanageable filth. For you, the peasant, the distinction is academic. You just know that every day begins and ends with the smell of waste and the fear of what that stench carries. The world outside your damp hut is governed by one single, implacable master, the sun. This is the tyranny of the sun, not in a pleasant, vitamin D-rich way, but in the relentless, demanding way that dictates every single moment of your waking life. You have no reliable mechanical clock. The closest you get is the church bell, but even that is often approximate, signaling the hours of prayer rather than the specific time of day. Your body clock, therefore, is intimately, painfully linked to the agricultural cycle and the available daylight. You trudge out of your door before sunrise, often while the air is still bitterly cold, because every single minute of light must be maximized for survival. Think of your modern routine. You set an alarm, you hit snooze, you enjoy a leisurely coffee. Stop. None of that applies here. If the sun is up, you are working. Period. If it's summer, that means a staggering, back-breaking 12 to 15 hours of continuous physical labor. There are no weekends, no sick days, and certainly no annual leave. Your muscles ache before the day even truly begins. The sheer physical commitment required to exist in the Middle Ages is something we, with our sedentary jobs and ergonomic chairs, can barely comprehend. You are essentially a human machine powered by poor quality grain, constantly fighting fatigue, minor injury, and the ever-present threat of hunger. Your primary duty as a serf is to work the fields. This involves tasks that are intensely physical and remarkably inefficient by modern standards. You are walking behind a heavy wooden plow, pulled by oxen, or perhaps just yourself, and your family members, if you are poor and cannot afford draft animals. You are breaking the dense earth, casting seeds by hand, scything the hay, and threshing the grain. Each step is a struggle, and the tools are clumsy and heavy. A mainstream historical fact is that the introduction of the heavy-wheeled plow, the karuka, in Northern Europe significantly increased agricultural yield by allowing deeper tilling of the richer, heavy soils, but it also required significantly more power, forcing communities to cooperate and share oxen. This shared resource was one of the few things that fostered genuine community cohesion, born out of brutal necessity. The daily cycle is broken only by brief, hurried meals, often eaten right there in the field. There is no such thing as a lunch break where you leave the site. You wolf down your coarse bread and perhaps a weak ale, and then it's straight back to the unforgiving earth. If you are extremely unlucky, you have to spend a significant portion of your best daylight hours working the domain, the specific land reserved exclusively for the lord of the manor. This is unpaid. Labor your feudal rent, and it always takes priority over your own small strips of land. You watch the sun move across the sky, knowing that every hour spent on the lord's field is an hour not spent ensuring your own family's survival. A little mental torment that gnaws at you constantly. A quirkier tidbit about this solar tyranny. The working day was often divided by the canonical hours, like matins, lauds, vespers, etc., the times the monks prayed. While the peasants didn't necessarily stop to pray, every time the bell rang, the bells acted as auditory markers, structuring the day into distinct, often short, periods of work between religious observations. It was an abstract, spiritual clock overlaid onto a very physical, earthy schedule. The only true breaks you get are the occasional feast days prescribed by the church, but even those are often punctuated by religious obligations that feel like more work than rest. You constantly monitor the weather, feeling a primal connection to the elements. A late frost can mean starvation. Too much rain can rot the crop. Too little rain turns your soil to concrete. You have no insurance, no government subsidies, only the mercy of the sky. This creates a deep-seated fatalism, a reliance on prayer and superstition, because you have absolutely no control over the major variables that determine if your children will eat next winter. You might complain about a long meeting at work today, but imagine if a single hailstorm could wipe out your entire annual income. That's the level of risk you live with every single day. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant experienced the concept of leisure time in the way we understand it today. Was the time spent spinning wool in the evening, or mending tools, considered rest, or just another mandatory part of the continuous labor required for existence? It likely varied wildly, but for the majority, the moments of true unproductive rest were incredibly rare and valued. You are so exhausted by the time you stumble back into your smoky hut that you barely have the energy to feed yourself before collapsing onto your straw pallet. only to repeat the cycle at the sun's first rays. Remember that damp, smoky smell from Section 1? It's just a constant backdrop to the ache in your back and the exhaustion in your bones. The brief respite of the night is precious, but far too short. You stumble in from the fields, your body screaming from the relentless labor dictated by the sun. And now comes the next great medieval challenge: food. This is a diet of gruel and grief, a reality defined by monotony, scarcity, and a constant, low-level hunger that never truly goes away. Forget your modern ideas of dietary variety, balanced meals, or seasonal produce. Your diet is a relentless, repetitive cycle of carbohydrates and fiber, designed purely for caloric survival, not pleasure or nutrition. The cornerstone of your existence, the very fuel that allows you to work the Lord's land and your own, is grain. Specifically, coarse grains like barley, oats, rye, or spelt, rather than the fine, desirable wheat, which is often reserved for the aristocracy or the church. You consume this grain in two primary forms: the aforementioned bread, which is dark, dense, and often so hard it requires soaking in liquid before consumption, and more commonly, pottage. Pottage is your daily sustenance, a thick, slow-cooked stew or gruel, often little more than boiled. Grains, legumes, beans, peas, or lentils, and whatever wild herbs or vegetables, cabbage, leeks, onions, you manage to forage or grow in your tiny garden plot. It is filling, yes, but spectacularly boring. You eat pottage for breakfast, pottage for lunch, often cold in the fields, and pottage for dinner. It's the same consistency, the same earthy taste, day in and day out. Imagine eating oatmeal, but savory and slightly burnt, 3 times a day for your entire life. That is your reality. The shocking lack of vitamins, especially vitamin C, if you live far from citrus-growing areas, and essential minerals, means that your body is constantly fighting deficiencies. You are perpetually tired, your teeth decay early, and your skin is prone to cracking and disease symptoms you simply attribute to the hardness of life, not a nutritional imbalance. Meat is a rare, almost mythical treat. You are not a regular consumer of protein. If you're lucky, you might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these are too valuable to eat regularly. They are saved for major feast days, religious festivals, or, more often, sold off to pay rents and taxes to the Lord. Sometimes, if you're very fortunate, the Lord allows peasants to hunt for small game on marginal land, or you might catch a fish from the local stream, but even these resources are often tightly controlled. A mainstream historical fact is that the forest and game laws were incredibly strict, meaning poaching a deer, which the nobility considered their exclusive right, could result in blinding or even death, demonstrating how the ruling class protected luxury food items with brutal force. Your one great comfort, as we briefly touched on in Section 2, is weak ale. The water is often dangerous, more on that later, so even your children drink a fermented, low-alcohol beverage made from the same grains that make your gruel. It's caloric, safer than water, and provides a very mild, persistent buzz that helps take the edge off the relentless ache in your back. You drink gallons of it a day. It's a necessary part of hydration and survival, not merely an indulgence. A quirky or fringe tidbit is related to the poor quality of the grain itself. Millstones often wore down, mixing tiny fragments of stone with the flour, a grit that would gradually erode the enamel of your teeth. That's why so many medieval skeletons show severe dental wear. It wasn't just poor hygiene, it was the stone in the bread. You are literally wearing your teeth down every time you eat your hard, fiber-heavy loaf. The concept of a balanced diet would be utterly foreign and frankly hilarious to you. Your goal is bulk. Your goal is calories. Your goal is survival until the next harvest. The great fear, the constant undercurrent of dread, is the hungry gap, the period just before the new harvest when the previous year's stores run dangerously low. Many peasants experienced actual starvation or near starvation during this gap, leading to widespread desperation and the unfortunate consumption of things like tree, bark, or famine bread made from dubious fillers. This is why you must ration, why every meal is meticulously planned and sparse, and why you never, ever waste a single crumb. Historians still argue whether the caloric intake of the average medieval peasant was consistently sufficient to support the immense physical labor demanded of them. Some sources suggest a diet that provided just enough energy to keep going, while others detail periods of devastating famine, indicating that the baseline state was a razor's edge between enough food and collapse. Regardless of the exact calorie count, you feel the persistent ache of not enoughness in your gut, the fatigue that no amount of sleep can cure, and the gnawing anxiety that this year's harvest might not be enough to get you through the next hungry gap. Just try to chew your hard bread slowly. It makes it feel like more. That chronic hunger you feel is intertwined with the constant, terrifying gamble you take every time you drink water. In the medieval world, the simple act of quenching your thirst is an invitation to deadly illness. Filth and waterborne disease are the silent, ubiquitous killers that haunt your life. The problem starts with the sanitation, or utter lack thereof. Remember the pervasive stench of the village, Section 1? That waste, human and animal, doesn't disappear. It seeps into the ground and, critically, runs into the same streams, rivers, and wells that serve as your only sources of drinking water. There is no concept of a separate sewage system. If you live near a river, it is used simultaneously for drinking, washing clothes, and disposing of latrine waste. The mainstream historical fact is that major waterborne illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were endemic, meaning they were always present in the population, spiking violently into epidemics during warmer months or periods of flood. These diseases, caused by bacteria and parasites, transmitted through contaminated water, were devastating, particularly to young children, and often killed swiftly through relentless dehydration. You are constantly struggling to find water that is even remotely safe. You might draw water from the village well, hoping it is deep enough to avoid contamination from the shallow pits nearby. But even a well is vulnerable. If a heavy rain washes surface refuse into the shaft, the entire village is suddenly drinking poison. In a medieval city, the situation is even more dire, as water is often carried through open wooden conduits or canals that double as open sewers. The knowledge you have about disease is based on guesswork and superstition. You might observe that the people who drink from the clear spring on the hill get less sick than those who draw from the polluted river, but you attribute it to the spring being a holy place, not to the absence of fecal bacteria. Your own body, already weakened by chronic malnutrition, Section 2, is less able to fight off these infections. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the common medieval practice of trying to purify water by passing it through a cloth filter or mixing it with wine vinegar, a slightly acidic substance that actually did kill some bacteria, though for reasons unknown to the people using it. Also, the widespread consumption of weak, small beer, low-alcohol ale, which we'll discuss later, was, ironically, a health measure. Because the water used to brew the beer was boiled, the resulting drink was often safer than the raw water supply. The fear of water contamination means every sickness in the village is met with a surge of panic. When someone gets the bloody flux, severe dysentery, the immediate assumption is that a curse has been laid or that God is punishing the community. The reality is often much simpler and more brutal. The recent heavy rains contaminated the well, and now you are all playing a lethal lottery. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rate in medieval Europe was primarily caused by the catastrophic, acute outbreaks of plague, like the Black Death, or the endemic constant toll taken by poor sanitation and waterborne illnesses that killed thousands every year. For you, shivering under your thin blanket with gut-wrenching cramps, you just pray to the saints that the fever breaks before the dehydration overwhelms you. The misery is constant, and it starts with the liquid you need to survive. The exhaustion you feel isn't just from malnutrition or disease. It's from the absolute, crushing requirement of endless, forced manual labor. Your position as a serf, or even a poor free peasant, locks you into the brute labor of serfdom, an existence defined by the relentless cycle of the seasons and the demands of your lord. Your life is essentially one of economic slavery. You are technically not owned, like a chattel slave, but you are tied irrevocably to the land of your lord. You cannot leave the manor without his permission, and he cannot take your land, your means of survival, away. This contract means your body is owed to his service for most of the working week. The mainstream historical fact is that the medieval economy was overwhelmingly agrarian, based on the manorial system in Western Europe. As a serf, you are obligated to work the lord's domain, his personal land, for an average of 2 to 3 days a week, plus extra work during peak periods like plowing and harvest. This obligation, known as corvée labor, was unpaid and took precedence over your work on your own small scattered strips of land. You had to tend to your lord's crops first, meaning your own family's survival often came second. The work itself is incredibly hard. You are pushing a heavy wooden plow, often pulled by a slow, stubborn ox or a team of horses, or sometimes, if your family is very poor, pulling it yourself. You are clearing dense thickets of thorn and brush by hand to expand the field. You are scything, harvesting, and threshing grain with simple, inefficient tools. Remember the Neolithic grind we discussed? This is its brutal continuation, powered by poor quality bread and watered down beer. You wake before dawn, often sleeping only 4 or 5 hours, and work until dusk. The pace is slow and monotonous, but the cumulative exhaustion is immense. Your body constantly aches, and permanent injuries, stiff joints, hunched back, damaged knees are common and accepted as the normal course of life. A serious injury is a disaster, as it means you cannot work, and a non-working serf is an unnecessary burden on the manor, often leading to deep poverty or expulsion. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the medieval workday. Unlike the modern 9 to 5, the medieval workday was measured by the sun and divided by the church's prayer hours, matins, prime, sext, vespers, etc. The most intense work was done during the longest days of the summer, requiring peasants to put in 14 to 16 hours of physical labor. However, there were frequent holy days of obligation, saints' days, and religious festivals that forced the Lord to give you time off, offering brief, vital periods of rest. I mean, thank goodness for those early holidays. The psychological toll is also heavy. You know that even your most back-breaking labor primarily benefits the Lord, who lives in relative luxury in the manor house. You are creating wealth you will never taste, and your children will be born into the exact same rigid cycle of debt and duty. Historians still argue whether the serf was more oppressed by the economic extraction, the percentage of your yield the Lord took, or the loss of personal freedom, the inability to leave the land or choose your profession. For you, pulling the heavy plow through the thick, yielding earth, the feeling is simple. You are enslaved to the soil, and your only freedom is the few hours of dim light between dusk and the next dawn. The sun is your timekeeper, and the soil is your master. That crushing labor and constant hunger you've become accustomed to are compounded by a deeper, quieter sorrow. The child mortality rate is staggering, and witnessing the death of young children is a common, expected, and heartbreaking part of your daily existence. Your approach to family and life itself is necessarily shaped by this omnipresent tragedy. The mainstream historical fact is that life expectancy at birth in the Middle Ages was often as low as 30 to 35 years. But this figure is heavily skewed by the horrific rate of infant and child mortality. Up to 1/3 of all children born would die before the age of 5, falling victim to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Many more wouldn't survive past their 10th birthday. For every 3 children you conceive, you can realistically expect only 1 or 2 to survive into adulthood. You, a medieval parent, are forced to develop an emotional defense mechanism against this constant loss. You love your children fiercely, but you cannot afford the deep emotional investment a modern parent makes. The high probability of their early death often led to a degree of emotional detachment during infancy, or at least a powerful, necessary resignation. You see neighbor after neighbor lose an infant to the bloody flux, dysentery, or a fever that sweeps through the village. Remember the filth and waterborne disease. When it happens in your own house, the grief is immense, but the tragedy is not unexpected. The causes of these deaths are numerous and often simple. The combination of chronic malnutrition, Section 2, the constant exposure to pathogens from poor sanitation, Section 3, and the brutal nature of medieval medicine, which we'll touch on later, creates a perfect storm. Even a simple fall or a mild cold can quickly become fatal when the child's body is already severely weakened. You are constantly monitoring your children for the first signs of fever, vomiting, or lethargy, knowing that once the illness takes hold, your ability to intervene is almost zero. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to unnamed children. In some regions, infants might not be given a formal name until they survived their first few months, or even a year, reflecting the grim reality that they might not live long enough to need one. They were sometimes referred to simply as babe or little one. This pragmatic delay in bestowing a formal identity was a cultural adaptation to the high rate of infant mortality, a heartbreaking practice designed to protect the parent's emotional health. When a child dies, the burial is usually simple, fast, and local. The body is often wrapped in a winding sheet and quickly interred in the village churchyard. There are no elaborate tombstones. The speed is essential, both for sanitary reasons and to allow the parents to return to the necessary labor of the field. You can't afford a week of grieving when the harvest is waiting. Historians still argue whether the high rate of child death caused a widespread cultural stoicism and emotional resilience in medieval people, or if it led to a pervasive sense of spiritual fatalism, a belief that all outcomes were entirely in God's hands, diminishing the role of human effort. You just know that you pray harder than anyone in the church, to Saint Catherine, the patron saint of children. And every time one of your young children laughs loudly, a sharp momentary pang of fear shoots through you, a fleeting reminder of the fragility of that life. Having survived the relentless toil and the constant threat of disease, you now retreat to your home, a structure that offers minimal comfort and zero relief from the hardships of the outside world. The reality of your peasant dwelling is one of darkness and cold, constantly choked by the thick air of smoke and cramped living. Your house is likely a single-room structure built of wattle and daub, woven sticks coated in mud and clay or rough timber, topped with a heavy thatched roof made of straw or reeds. It is designed less for comfort and more for keeping the elements out and the precious heat in. Windows are tiny, unglazed apertures, often just small slits covered with a piece of animal hide or wooden shutters, which you keep mostly closed against the cold. Consequently, the interior is perpetually dim, even in the middle of the day. The central feature of your home, and the source of its greatest discomfort, is the hearth. There is no chimney in most peasant homes. The fire is built on the floor or on a simple stone slab, and the smoke is intended to filter out through a small hole in the roof, or simply dissipate through the thatch. The reality is that much of the smoke fills the interior, clinging to the walls, your clothes, and your lungs. This smoke certainly helps preserve the thatch and drives out insects, but it causes chronic respiratory issues, eye irritation, and a permanent hacking cough. The mainstream historical fact is that the reliance on open hearths without chimneys meant that most peasant families suffered from chronic smoke inhalation, a major contributor to respiratory diseases, which were often fatal in a world without effective medicine. The interior walls were often coated in a thick layer of soot, absorbing what little light entered. Your house is also intensely cramped. Your entire extended family, parents, children, and perhaps an elderly relative sleeps, eats, and works in this single space. In colder months, you often bring your most valuable livestock, perhaps a pig or a few chickens, into a house for shared warmth and protection from thieves. The smell is awful, remember Section 1, and the lack of privacy is absolute, which we'll revisit later. But the combined heat from bodies, animals, and the open fire is essential for surviving the winter. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the eaves of the roof. The thick thatched roof provided excellent insulation, but the eaves often came down low over the walls. These eaves were a favorite habitat for mice, rats, and various vermin, who would often scurry inside the thatch, making scratching noises directly above your head as you tried to sleep. The knowledge that rodents were constantly living in your roof structure was a pervasive low-level anxiety. I mean, good luck sleeping through that ASMR. In the winter, the struggle is constant. You try to insulate the floor with fresh straw, but the cold seeps up from the damp earth. You sleep huddled together under shared animal hides or coarse woolen blankets. Your meager body heat your best defense against the bitter chill. The cold also limits your ability to work outside, making the short winter days a time of hunger and intense, close-quarters confinement. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasants suffered more from the physical discomfort of the cold and the smoke, or the psychological toll of the unrelenting lack of privacy and personal space within these tiny dwellings. As you cough against the sharp, stinging smoke that drifts across your face, you pull the woolen blanket tighter, grateful for the minuscule warmth, but dreading the persistent ache in your chest. You are not only battling the cold, the hunger, and the filth. You are also facing the terrifying reality that when serious illness strikes, the people you rely on for aid are often steeped in superstition and ineffective remedies. You are at the mercy of medieval medicine's brutal truth. If that chronic cough from the smoky air, remember Section 6, escalates into a fierce, consuming fever, your recourse is limited and often painful. There is no understanding of germs, antibiotics, or sterile procedures. Disease is understood through the lens of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness is believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humors, requiring a violent intervention to restore equilibrium. The mainstream historical fact is that the most common treatment was bloodletting. The barber surgeon, a person who doubled as a hair cutter and a quasi-medical practitioner often lacking formal medical training, would cut a vein or use leeches to drain a quantity of blood, believing this would reduce the excess of a hot humor like blood itself. This practice, far from helping, often weakened an already ill and malnourished body, increasing the risk of infection and pushing the patient toward death. You might also be subjected to various emetics and purgatives, foul-tasting concoctions designed to induce violent vomiting or diarrhea, believed to expel the bad humors or the poison causing the illness. These cures, often made from herbal mixtures or unpleasant animal products, were incredibly harsh on the digestive system, exacerbating the dehydration already threatening your life. Remember the waterborne diseases from Section 3. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the use of astrology and uroscopy. Physicians often relied on the position of the stars or the appearance of your urine, uroscopy, to make a diagnosis. The color, cloudiness, and even the smell of the urine were analyzed in great detail using complex charts, sometimes even consulting a vial of your urine before a single question was asked about your symptoms. I mean, trying to diagnose the Black Death by looking at a jar of pee is pretty ambitious, even for the Middle Ages. For injuries, the situation is equally grim. If you suffer a deep cut or a broken bone while working in the fields, the risk of sepsis and gangrene is incredibly high, as the surgeon will operate with unsterilized tools and contaminated hands. Amputation is a common, brutal solution to severe limb injury, often performed without effective anesthesia, relying only on large doses of cheap wine or a hard blow to the head to dull the pain. Historians still argue whether the peasant received better or worse care than the nobility. While the nobility could afford trained physicians, those physicians were often wedded to the dangerous humoral theory. Peasants often relied on local cunning women or herbalists, whose traditional remedies, based on centuries of practical, empirical knowledge of local plants, were sometimes more effective and less harmful than the university-trained medical consensus. As you swallow a dose of bitter herbal potion and feel the dull pressure of the leech attached to your arm, you know your survival is less about the skill of the person treating you and more about the simple, desperate resilience of your own body. You pray to the saints for healing, knowing that the cure itself might be what kills you. The hardships of your body, the stench, the hunger, the constant work are mirrored by the intense, inescapable pressures on your mind, dictated by the Church's psychological grip. The medieval world is fundamentally defined by Christianity, and the promise of heaven and the threat of hell dictate almost every decision you make, turning your faith into a source of both solace and profound terror. You live in a time when the Church is the most powerful institution on earth, often rivaling the authority of kings and lords. Everything you do, from how you plow your field to how you spend your one day of rest, is governed by religious doctrine. Your entire worldview is one of spiritual urgency. This brief, miserable life is merely a trial, a fleeting moment of suffering that determines your eternal fate. This concept is the primary psychological tool used to keep the brutal reality of your life tolerable. The suffering you endure now is a ticket to everlasting paradise. The mainstream historical fact is the pervasive influence of the sacraments, particularly confession and penance. You are constantly reminded of your inherent sinfulness and the necessity of the priest, the Church, to act as the intermediary between you and God. You must attend Mass, confess your sins, and perform acts of penance fasting, pilgrimages, or extra labor to secure your salvation. This ritualistic dependence on the Church is absolute. This spiritual focus turns your miserable life into a constant source of fear. The world is filled with demons, devils, and unseen evil forces that are constantly trying to trick you into sin. A crop failure isn't just bad weather. It might be the wrath of God or the work of a local witch collaborating with the devil. If your child dies, remember Section 5. You are consumed with worry that they might not have been baptized in time, condemning their soul to limbo or worse, hell. This fear motivates you to follow rules that make your physical life harder, such as the strict fasting during Lent, which exacerbates your chronic hunger, Section 2. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the medieval belief in the power of bells. Church bells were not just used to call people to prayer. They were actively believed to ward off evil spirits and even bad weather, particularly lightning and storms. You might have heard the bell ringer diligently tolling the bell during a fierce thunderstorm, desperately trying to protect the village from a divine strike, believing his labor to be just as vital as yours in the field. The psychological comfort the Church offers is real, though. The hope of heaven is a powerful sedative against the pain of your existence. Saints offer you a personal advocate to petition God on your behalf. Yet even this solace comes with a cost. You are forced to pay a tithe, tax usually 1/10 of your meager yield directly to the Church, adding another layer of economic extraction to your already precarious life, which we'll explore more fully later. Historians still argue whether the omnipresent spiritual fatalism, encouraged by the Church, served primarily as a tool for social control by the elite, ensuring the serfs remained passive and obedient, or whether it was a genuine, necessary source of psychological resilience that allowed medieval people to cope with their brutal lives. As you kneel on the cold, damp stone floor of the village church, praying to a remote, judgmental God, you just know that your only reward for this miserable life is the fragile, unproven promise of the next. The only source of power you see outside the church is your local Lord, but the authority he wields is often exercised not through complex legal codes, but through brute force and arbitrary whim. You live under the law's arbitrary cruelty, where justice is swift, local, and often dispensed through physical ordeal rather than rational inquiry. The concept of a centralized, fair judicial system is alien to you. Justice is handled by the lord of the manor or his bailiff, who acts as judge, jury, and executioner. The law is less about precedent and more about preserving the social hierarchy and the lord's financial interests. If you are accused of stealing a rabbit from the lord's forest, a serious crime, remember, since the game belongs to him, you will be tried not by a jury of your peers, but by the lord's own court, where the deck is heavily stacked against you. The mainstream historical fact is the reliance on trial by ordeal in the early Middle Ages, particularly for capital crimes, or those where evidence was unclear. Ordeals were tests rooted in religious faith, where God was presumed to intervene to reveal the truth. These included the ordeal of hot iron, carrying a red-hot bar of iron for a set distance, with guilt determined by how quickly the wound healed, or the ordeal of cold water, being thrown into consecrated water. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. These trials were brutal and often ended in injury or death, regardless of actual guilt. Even when you move towards slightly more rational systems in the High Middle Ages, justice remains weighted by class. A noble accused of murder might face a trial by combat, fighting a champion, while a peasant accused of a minor theft might have his hand cut off in the village square. Your low status means your testimony carries almost no weight against that of a noble or even a free man. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the use of trial by food. In some Saxon legal codes, a priest accused of theft might undergo the ordeal of the corsned, where he had to swallow a piece of consecrated bread and cheese. If he choked, he was guilty. If he swallowed, he was innocent. Given your chronic hunger, Section 2, the temptation to quickly swallow any food, holy or otherwise, would be strong, possibly leading to an unfortunate accident. I mean, getting convicted by a hasty lunch is truly rough. The purpose of these punishments is not rehabilitation. It is deterrence and spectacle. Punishments whipping, branding, mutilation, cutting off an ear or a hand, or hanging are carried out in public to ensure that everyone in the village internalizes the Lord's power. The fear of this arbitrary, brutal justice is what keeps you tied to your plot of land and prevents you from risking petty theft, even when starving. Historians still argue whether the decline of trial by ordeal and the rise of the jury system were driven primarily by the church as skepticism regarding these tests, or by the growing influence of Roman law and centralized royal authority. For you, the peasant, the system is simply terrifying. You just keep your head down, work your fields, and pray that the Lord's bailiff never, ever looks your way. Having faced the Lord's arbitrary law, you return to the one thing you can rely on, your daily meals. However, your diet of grain and bad beer is monotonous, nutritionally sparse, and constantly skirts the line of dangerous contamination, continuing the misery we discussed earlier, Section 2. Your entire caloric intake is based on cereals, primarily the cheapest and heartiest grains like rye, barley, and oats. These are cooked into your staples, the thick, dark, heavy peasant bread, often called maslin bread, a mix of rye and wheat, if you are lucky, and pottage, a thick, soupy gruel. You eat these two things in slightly varying forms, 3 times a day, almost every day of the year. The bread is coarse, often containing bits of hull, grit from the grinding stones, and sometimes even foreign seeds or dirt, which contribute to your chronic dental issues. Recall the Neolithic analogy. The pottage is made by boiling grains, vegetables like peas, beans, or wild onions, and whatever meager scraps you can afford in water or whey. It is prepared in one large pot that sits constantly over the fire, with new ingredients added throughout the day, often lending it a slightly sour or fermented taste. The mainstream historical fact is that the peasant diet was incredibly low in meat protein, fresh fruit, and sugar. The majority of the diet, up to 80% of calories, came directly from cereals. Meat was consumed only a few times a year, usually at a major religious feast like Easter or Christmas, or if a pig was slaughtered in the autumn. Your body is perpetually working on low-grade, high-fiber fuel. To wash down this heavy, dry diet, you rely on beer or ale. Water, as established, Section 3, is highly dangerous. Therefore, the most common beverage, even for children, is small beer a week. Low-alcohol brew made by boiling water with malted grains. This boiling process made it the safest, most reliable liquid available. While low in alcohol, you drink it constantly, throughout the day. You are almost never fully sober, though you are far from drunk, simply existing in a perpetual state of mild intoxication. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the medieval reverence for onions and garlic. These plants were highly valued, not just for their flavor, which helped mask the taste of the rough food, but for their strong antiseptic qualities. Medieval people believed their pungent smell helped ward off disease and bad air, miasma, leading to their widespread consumption in often massive quantities. I mean, good luck with any kind of intimate conversation. The lack of variety means that even a minor nutritional deficiency can become chronic and widespread. For example, a lack of vitamin C, found in citrus and fresh greens, meant that diseases like scurvy were a constant, underlying health issue, weakening your body and contributing to your high mortality rate. Historians still argue whether the commonality of ale consumption was a deliberate nutritional strategy, a source of calories and safety, or if it was simply a matter of preference, given the blandness of the rest of the diet. For you, the peasant, you just reach for your wooden tankard of ale, grateful for the familiar, slightly yeasty taste that ensures your survival for another day. You chew slowly on your tough bread, knowing that every bite is a battle against the grain, the grime, and the chronic hunger. The silence in the village today is different. It's not the quiet of Sunday prayer or the hush before a storm. It's a heavy, oppressive stillness that hangs in the air like the smoke in your hut. You notice that the church bell has been ringing oddly not the rhythmic toll for a single funeral, but a frantic, constant clanging that seems to have no end. And then it stops, not because the grief is over, but because the bell ringer is dead. Welcome to the era of the Black Death. This isn't just a bad flu season. It is the single most defining event of the medieval experience, a mainstream historical fact that shattered the world. Arriving in Europe around 1347, the pestilence didn't just kill people. It hollowed out civilization. In the span of a few years, it wiped out between 30% to 60% of the entire population of Europe. Imagine every second or third person you know, your neighbor, your priest, your child, the bailiff dropping dead within weeks. The social fabric didn't just tear, it disintegrated. The terror begins with a rumor from the port cities, ships arriving with crews of corpses. Then it moves inland, carried not by an army, but by the very things we've already discussed, the fleas on the rats and the lice on your own body. Remember those itchy companions you learned to live with in Section 5? They have now been weaponized. The bacteria Yersinia pestis is hitching a ride in their bellies, waiting to regurgitate into your bloodstream. The symptoms are the stuff of nightmares. You wake up with a fever, shivering violently. Then come the bubo's grotesque, egg-sized swellings in your groin, armpits, or neck. They are black, purple, and ooze pus and blood. They are incredibly painful. Hence the nursery rhyme, ring-a-ring-o roses, referring to the rash. A pocket full of posies to hide the smell. A tissue, the sneezing pneumonic phase. We all fall down, dead. Although folklore historians argue about the rhyme's true origin, the imagery perfectly captures the swift, horrifying progression. You might go to sleep healthy and be dead by sunrise. The speed of the contagion is baffling to your medieval mind. Is it God's wrath? Is it a planetary alignment? Is it poisoned wells? Here's a quirky, gruesome tidbit. A psychological response produced the phenomenon of the flagellants. These were bands of religious zealots who believed the plague was a divine punishment for the world as sins. They would travel from town to town, shirtless, whipping themselves with scourges tipped with iron spikes until the blood ran down their backs, chanting hymns. They were a walking horror show, a desperate, bloody parade trying to appease an angry God. Ironically, by moving from town to town and bleeding everywhere, they were likely super spreaders of the very disease they were trying to stop. The psychological toll is inescapable. The medieval mindset shifts to memento mori. Remember you must die. Art becomes obsessed with death. You see the danse macabre painted on church walls, skeletons dancing with kings, popes, and peasants alike. The message is clear. Death is the great equalizer. It doesn't care about your rank, your money, or your clean linen. It is coming for everyone. For you, the peasant, the reality is practical and horrifying. There are too many bodies for proper Christian burials. The churchyard is full. You dig mass graves, long trenches where bodies are stacked like cordwood, sprinkled with a thin layer of lime. You drag your own family members to the pit, offering a mumbled prayer because the priest is dead or too terrified to administer last rites. The social contract of a good death that we discussed in Section 10 has been voided. You die alone, unshriven, and terrified. Here's a light joke for the apocalypse. Why did the rat join the medieval band? Because he was great at spreading the hits. Too soon? It's been 700 years. Historians still argue vehemently about the primary transmission vector of the Black Death. For decades, the Black Rat, Rattus rattus, took the blame. But newer models suggest that the speed of the spread was too fast for rats alone. The current debate points the finger back at human ectoparasites, our old friends, the human body louse and flea. If this is true, it means the plague wasn't just an external invader. It was spread by the very clothes on your back and the intimate crowding of your homes. You were killing each other simply by being close. If you are one of the lucky ones who is genetically resistant, or just incredibly fortunate, you emerge into a changed world. The fields are overgrown. The cattle are wandering aimlessly, unmilked. Entire villages, known as lost villages, are abandoned, the houses left to rot. Silence rules. And here is the brutal irony, if you survive, your life might actually get better economically. With half the workforce gone, labor is suddenly scarce. The Lord needs you more than you need him. Wages rise, despite laws trying to cap them, and the grip of serfdom begins to loosen. The golden age of the peasant, a relative term, meaning you might eat meat twice a week instead of never, is built on a mountain of corpses. You walk through the empty village. The door to the baker's house bangs open in the wind. A stray dog gnaws on something in the street that you don't want to look at too closely. You survived the great mortality, but the systems of law and order are fraying. The Lord is angry about his lost prophets. The king is demanding taxes to fight wars that seem pointless now, and the church has lost some of its invincibility after all. Their prayers didn't stop the buboes. You realize that while the bacteria might be retreating for now, the cruelty of men is just ramping up. The chaos left by the plague breeds a new kind of harshness. Justice becomes swifter and more brutal as the authorities try to regain control of a world that has slipped through their fingers. You wash the lime from your hands, but the smell of death never really leaves your nose. You look towards the town square where the gibbet stands and realize that surviving the disease was the easy part. Surviving the justice of the survivors is next. You're walking through the market square, Trying to look inconspicuous, a difficult task when everyone knows everyone's business, when a hand grabs your tunic. You haven't paid your rent, or maybe you poached a rabbit, or perhaps someone just didn't like the way you looked at their pig. Whatever the reason, you have now entered the terrifying machinery of the medieval justice system. Forget innocent until proven guilty. In this world, you are guilty until God performs a miracle. The mainstream historical fact you need to know is that medieval justice relied heavily on trial by ordeal. The legal logic was surprisingly simple. Humans are easily fooled, but God is omniscient. Therefore, the best way to determine guilt was to subject the accused to a painful, dangerous test and see if the Almighty intervened. If you were innocent, God would protect you from harm or heal you miraculously fast. If you were guilty, you'd rot. Imagine you are accused of theft. You might face the ordeal by fire. You have to carry a piece of red-hot iron for 9 feet. Your hand is then bandaged. 3 days later, the priest unwrap it. If the wound is healing cleanly, praise the Lord, you're innocent. If it's festering or infected, which, given the lack of antibiotics and the burn trauma, is highly likely, you are guilty. Your punishment? Likely hanging, or at least mutilation. Essentially, the justice system was a coin toss, where heads you suffer a 3rd-degree burn, and tails you get executed. Or consider the ordeal by water. You are bound and thrown into a consecrated pond. If you sink, the water, a pure element, has accepted you, meaning you are innocent. Hopefully, they fish you out before you drown. If you float, the water has rejected you, proving your guilt. It's a lose-lose scenario that makes modern parking tickets feel like a blessing. Here is a light joke for the legal team. Why was the medieval judge so good at his job? Because he always hung around for the verdict. And because he didn't have to study law, just theology. Policing was also a do-it-yourself affair. There was no uniformed police force. If a crime was committed, it was up to the victim to raise the hue and cry. You had to scream, shout, and blow a horn. Every able-bodied man within earshot was legally required to drop his tools and join the chase. If you heard the cry and ignored it, you were fined. You were the deputy, whether you liked it or not. This created a society of constant surveillance, where your neighbors were your jailers. Now for a truly quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit: animal trials. Animals were considered morally responsible creatures. If a pig ate a child, which happened more often than you'd like to know, or a swarm of weevils destroyed a crop, they could be taken to court. They would be appointed a defense lawyer. Witnesses would be called. The judge would hear arguments. In 1386, a pig in France was found guilty of murder, dressed in a waistcoat and breeches, and publicly hanged in the town square. This wasn't a joke. It was a serious legal proceeding to restore the order of nature. So if your dog digs up the Lord's flower bed, start looking for a solicitor. If you weren't subjected to an ordeal, you might face the pillory or the stocks. This wasn't just physical punishment. It was weaponized shame. You were locked in a wooden frame in the center of town. The physical pain was real cramped muscles, exposure to the sun or rain, but the social pain was worse. The entire village was invited to jeer at you, spit on you, and throw rotten vegetables, mud, or worse. For a medieval person whose survival depended on community reputation, this was social death. You became a laughingstock, stripped of your dignity. Torture was another standard tool, but not just for punishment. It was a procedural part of the investigation. In many jurisdictions, a confession was required for a conviction. How do you get a confession? You use the rack, the thumbscrew, or the strappado, where your hands are tied behind your back and you are hoisted into the air. This wasn't seen as sadistic, though it was. It was seen as necessary to extract the truth. The irony, of course, is that anyone will confess to killing the Pope if you stretch their limbs far enough. Here's another light joke. The executioner says to the prisoner, "I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is I'm going to chop your head off." The prisoner asks, "What's the good news?" The executioner replies, "I just sharpened the axe, so it won't take all day." Historians still argue whether the infamous Bloody Code, the list of crimes punishable by death, was actually enforced as ruthlessly as the statute suggests, or if local juries often practiced pious perjury, deliberately undervaluing stolen goods to save the thief from the gallows. Did the community temper the brutality of the law with their own unwritten code of mercy, or was the countryside truly a landscape of gibbets and rotting corpses? Speaking of gibbets, we have to talk about the theater of execution. Punishments were public events, designed to be terrifying spectacles. If you were a traitor, you were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a process too graphic to describe in detail. But let's just say it involved being kept alive while your insides were made outsides. These executions drew massive crowds. It was entertainment, a grim warning, and a reaffirmation of the king's power, all rolled into one. You would take your children to watch, pointing at the severed head on a spike as a lesson. See that? Don't steal the king's deer. But there was one loophole: benefit of clergy. If you could prove you were a member of the clergy, you could be tried in the church courts, which were much more lenient. They couldn't spill blood. How did you prove it? You had to read a specific passage from the Bible, Psalm 51. Since literacy was rare outside the church, reading was the proof. This led to criminals memorizing the neck verse to save their necks. If you could recite it, you might get away with a branding on the thumb instead of a hanging. It was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for the educated. As you stand in the crowd, watching a neighbor being flogged for laziness or heresy, you feel a mix of relief and terror. Relief that it's not you, and terror that tomorrow it could be. The line between a free peasant and a condemned criminal is razor thin, often depending on the mood of the Lord or the accusation of a jealous rival. But while the law tried to control your body, the church tried to control your soul, and more specifically, your bedroom. You might think your private life is private, but in the Middle Ages, nothing is off limits. The priest has a lot of questions about what you're doing in the dark, and frankly, you're not going to like the answers. Let's move from the courtroom to the confessional, where things get even more invasive. You might think that after the grueling labor, the bad food, and the constant fear of the gibbet, the one place you could find some freedom would be in the privacy of your own bed or straw sack. You would be wrong. In the Middle Ages, there is no such thing as a private life. Your bedroom is a public battleground, and the referee is the church. The mainstream historical fact here is the absolute ecclesiastical regulation of intimacy. The church viewed sex not as an expression of love, but as a dangerous, volatile force that had to be strictly contained. The only, and I mean only, legitimate purpose for sex was procreation within marriage. Anything else was a sin. Pleasure was not the goal. It was an unfortunate side effect. In fact, enjoying it too much, even with your spouse, was considered adultery in the eyes of some theologians because you were letting lust take over reason. You were supposed to do your duty, make a baby, and go to sleep. But it gets much more bureaucratic than that. The church had a calendar that would make a modern scheduler weep. You were forbidden from having relations on Sundays, God's Day, Wednesdays and Fridays, fast days, the 40 days of Lent, the 40 days before Christmas, Advent, Easter week, Pentecost week, and any major feast, day of a saint, and there were a lot of saints. When you add in the times a woman was unclean, menstruation, pregnancy, and 40 days after childbirth, historians estimate that a pious medieval couple was legally allowed to have sex on only about 44 days a year. Your love life was effectively dictated by a liturgical spreadsheet. Here is a light joke for the romantics. Why was the medieval husband always checking the almanac? He was trying to find a date night that didn't result in eternal damnation. Now for the quirky, slightly voyeuristic tidbit, the penitentials. These were handbooks for priests, listing every conceivable sin and the appropriate penance, punishment for it. They are obsessed with the mechanics of sex. They list specific positions, specific acts, and specific fines in days of fasting for each deviation. The missionary position, man on top, woman on bottom, was the only natural one. Anything else was against nature. If you were caught or confessed to deviating from the norm, you might be fasting on bread and water for years. The priest in the confessional wasn't just asking, "Did you sin?" He was asking for a play-by-play diagram. This obsession with control extended to the legal system as well. If you were a serf, you didn't even own the right to marry without permission. You had to pay a fine called merchant to the lord to let your daughter marry. Why? Because the lord was losing a worker or breeding stock from his land. There was also leerwhite, a fine for unmarried women who got pregnant. It translates roughly to lying down fine. The lord was essentially taxing your libido. Your body was an economic asset, and unauthorized use was property theft. Historians still argue whether these strict rules were actually followed by the common people, or if they were merely the wishful thinking of celibate monks writing in ivory towers. Did the average peasant in a muddy village really stop on a Tuesday because it was St. Swithin's Day? The existence of bawdy tailies, like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, suggests a much earthier, rule-breaking reality, but the guilt and the fear of hell are undoubtedly powerful buzzkills. Let's talk about the gender dynamics, which were frankly terrible. Women were viewed through the lens of Eve, the original temptress who caused the fall of man. They were seen as insatiable, weak-willed, and dangerous to men's salvation. A man was the head of the household, and he was legally allowed, even encouraged, to physically chastise, beat, his wife to keep her in line, provided he didn't kill her or break a bone. This wasn't abuse. It was considered correction. However, there was a strange paradox. The church also taught the marital debt. This meant that both husband and wife had a legal obligation to provide sex to their spouse upon request, to prevent them from falling into the sin of adultery. If a husband refused his wife, or vice versa, they could actually be taken to a church court and ordered to perform. Imagine a judge legally mandating that you sleep with your spouse. It turns intimacy into a chore, a literal debt to be paid like a bag of grain. Here's a light joke. A peasant woman goes to the priest and says, "Father, my husband treats me like a queen." The priest asks, "He honors and serves you?" She replies, "No, he locks me in a tower and fights anyone who comes near the door." The consequences of sin were visible. If you were caught in adultery, the punishment was public humiliation. You might be forced to walk through the market square in your underwear, or less, carrying a candle, while the town jeered. This was the walk of shame, taken to a literal, institutionalized extreme. For the priesthood, who were supposed to be celibate, the reality was often different. Many village priests had housekeepers, who were effectively common law wives, and everyone knew it. The bishop would often turn a blind eye as long as the priest paid a cradle tax for any children produced. Hypocrisy was just another layer of the social fabric. This constant surveillance of your private life creates a specific kind of psychological pressure. You can never truly relax. You are always being watched by your neighbors, who love to gossip, by the priest, who holds the keys to heaven, and by God himself. Every desire is analyzed for sin. Every impulse is a potential trap. The bedroom, which should be a sanctuary, is just another room where you have to follow the rules or face the consequences. And how did you learn all these complex rules about days, positions, and penances? Well, mostly you were told them. You certainly didn't read them. Literacy was a superpower you didn't possess. Knowledge was a gated community, and you were on the outside looking in. This lack of access to information wasn't an accident. It was a structural necessity to keep you exactly where you were. Let's turn the page, or rather, stare at the blank parchment, and look at the state of education. You're staring at this script well, in our shared imagination reading these words, processing complex ideas, maybe even scrolling back to check a fact. You take this skill for granted. But if I dropped you back into your medieval body right now, this text would look like alien hieroglyphs. You wouldn't be able to read the road sign warning you of bandits, the contract the Lord just cheated you with, or even the Bible that supposedly saves your soul. You are locked in a prison of ignorance, and the authorities have the only key. The mainstream historical fact is that literacy was a guarded monopoly of the church. For centuries, the ability to read and write was almost exclusively the domain of the clergy. The word clerk comes from cleric. Latin was the language of power, law, and God. You, the peasant, speak a vernacular dialect Middle English, Old French, or a local German patois, which is considered vulgar and unworthy of serious documentation. Because the Bible and the church services are in Latin, you are completely dependent on the priest to interpret the will of God for you. He is the filter. If he tells you the Bible says, "Pay the priest extra eggs on Tuesday," who are you to argue? You can't check the source material. Education for the common person didn't take place in a classroom with a chalkboard. It happened in the mud. You learned through apprenticeship or simply sitting by Nellie. You watched your father plow. You watched your mother spin. And if you did it wrong, you got a clip round the ear. Knowledge was physical, tactile, and oral. It was memorized in rhymes and songs because there was no way to write it down. If a master craftsman died without passing on his secrets, that technology simply vanished from the village. Here is a light joke for the students. Why did the medieval student get kicked out of class? Because he was caught using a tablet, a wax one, and he melted it by the fire. Okay, tech jokes don't translate well to 1350, but bear with me. If you were one of the incredibly lucky few, perhaps a merchant, son, or a bright peasant boy sponsored by a local monastery, you might encounter the hornbook. This is a quirky physical tidbit of medieval learning. It wasn't a book at all, but a wooden paddle with a handle. Attached to the face was a single sheet of parchment displaying the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. To protect the precious paper from sticky, grubby children's fingers, it was covered by a thin, transparent slice of animal horn, cow or sheep horn boiled and flattened. That was your iPad. That was your entire library for the first 3 years of school. You wore it on your belt. If you lost it, you were beaten. If you broke it, you were beaten. There was a lot of beating involved in medieval education. The danger of learning, however, wasn't just about harsh teachers. It was about heresy. As we move into the later Middle Ages, the idea of translating the Bible into English, or any common tongue, became a flashpoint. The church believed that common people were too stupid to understand the complexities of Scripture and would inevitably misinterpret it, leading to the damnation of their souls. Therefore, owning a Bible in English, like the Wycliffe Bible, was illegal. You could be burned at the stake for simply trying to read the words of Jesus in your own language. Literacy wasn't just a skill, it was a potential death sentence. Knowledge was a controlled substance. Here's a light joke about the libraries. A monk walks into the scriptorium and says, "I have a complaint." The head abbot says, "Gee, this is a quiet zone. What is it?" The monk whispers, "My copy of the Apocalypse is missing the ending." The abbot replies, "Don't worry, it's not the end of the world." Historians still argue about the true extent of pragmatic literacy among the lay people. While they couldn't read Virgil or write a theological treatise, many merchants and bailiffs could likely read a ledger, sign their names, and understand basic contracts. Was the Dark Ages really as illiterate as we think? Or was there a hidden layer of functional reading that simply didn't leave a mark on the history books? The debate suggests that medieval people were perhaps smarter and more adaptable than the dumb peasant trope suggests, utilizing visual cues, tallies, and basic symbols to navigate a complex economy. University life, for those who made it, was rowdy and dangerous. Students at Oxford or Paris were technically clergy, minor orders, meaning they had legal immunity from the town watch. They were notorious for drinking, gambling, and fighting. Town versus gown riots were real battles where students and locals would kill each other in the streets over the price of wine or a perceived insult. A bachelor's degree was literally a badge of survival. But for you, back in the village, the world is small. Your history is what your grandfather remembers. Your geography is as far as you can walk in a day. You rely on traveling minstrels or news criers for information about the wider world, and their stories are half-truth, half-fantasy. You are disconnected, and yet there is a different kind of education you are forced to master. The education of survival in a violent world. You might not know how to conjugate a Latin verb, but you know exactly what to do when the warning beacon is lit on the hill. You know the sound of marching feet, because while the church owns your soul and the Lord owns your labor, the king owns your body for his wars. And the lesson you are about to learn is that glory is a lie told by poets who never stood in a shield wall. You are standing in your field, leaning on your hoe, perhaps enjoying a rare moment of sunshine and dreaming about that weak ale waiting for you when you hear it. A deep rumble in the earth. It's not thunder. It's the sound of horses. Lots of them. Your stomach drops, not because you fear a stampede, but because you know exactly what follows the horses. The king is bored or angry or broke, and he has decided that your little patch of mud is now a strategic asset. The mainstream historical fact here is the devastating strategy known as the chevauqué. When we think of medieval war, we think of glorious charges, Agincourt, or knights jousting for honor. But the reality of feudal warfare was essentially grand-scale arson. The goal wasn't necessarily to capture territory. It was to destroy the enemy's economic base. And guess what the economic base is? It's you. It's your barn, your crops, your cow. An invading army would sweep through a region burning everything they couldn't carry, slaughtering livestock, and destroying mills just to deny resources to the opposing lord. You are not a combatant. You are collateral damage in a dispute between two rich cousins speaking French. When the call to arms comes the array of arms, you do and get a shiny suit of armor. You are the levy. You are expected to show up with a padded jacket, a gambeson, if you're lucky, an iron helmet if you've inherited one, and a weapon. And since you can't afford a sword, your weapon is likely the same tool you were just using to farm. This brings us to the billhook, a vicious instrument originally designed for pruning trees, now used for hooking a knight off his horse, and, well, pruning the knight. You are dragging your livelihood into the mud to hack at strangers. Here is a light joke for the recruits. Why is the knight's armor so expensive? Because it costs an arm and a leg. To protect an arm and a leg. And if he falls off his horse, he looks like a turtle on its back, which is your only chance. Now for a quirky athletic tidbit. If you were an Englishman in a later medieval period, your Sunday afternoons were legally hijacked. In 1363, King Edward III passed the Archery Acts, which banned idle games like football, yes, soccer, handball, and cockfighting. Why? Because he needed you to practice the longbow. Every able-bodied man was required to practice archery on holy days. The iconic English longbowman wasn't a professional soldier. He was a peasant who had been forced to warp his skeleton literally. Skeletons of archers show enlarged left arms and spinal deformities from childhood to pull a 100-pound draw weight. Your leisure time was actually covert military training. So you march, and you march, and you march. The roads, which we will complain about shortly, are a quagmire. You aren't paid a salary in the modern sense. You are often fighting for the promise of plunder, which usually amounts to stealing a better pair of boots from a corpse. The logistics of a medieval army are a nightmare. They practice purveyance, which is a fancy word for the king's officials taking your food and giving you a worthless IOU. An army on the march is like a swarm of locusts. Even if they are your own side, they eat your winter grain stores and drink your village dry. Historians still argue whether the infantry revolution of the 14th century, where disciplined peasant spearmen and archers began to defeat mounted knights, think Battle of the Golden Spurs or Cressy, actually improved the social standing of the lower classes. Did realizing that a farm boy could kill a duke with a pointy stick break the mystique of the nobility? Or did the aristocracy just adapt their tactics and double down on oppression? It's a fierce debate, but standing there in the rain with a spear, you don't feel very revolutionary. You just feel wet. The camp life is even deadlier than the battle. Remember our discussion about hygiene in Section 5? Now imagine 10,000 men with no latrines, drinking from the same stream. Dysentery, the bloody flux, killed far more soldiers than swords ever did. You watch your friends waste away, shivering in their own filth, defeated by bacteria before they ever see an enemy. If you do get wounded, you're back to the tender mercies of the barber surgeon. A gut wound is a death sentence. A broken bone might heal, or it might leave you a cripple, ending your days as a productive farmer and turning you into a beggar. Here's a light joke for the campfire. A soldier asks the mercenary, "Do you fight for money?" The mercenary says, "I do." The soldier says, "I fight for honor." The mercenary shrugs, "We both fight for what we lack." If you survive the campaign, the homecoming is often the cruelest part. You might return to find your field overgrown or, worse, burned by a chevauqué while you were away. Your livestock is gone. Your family is indebted. The glory of war has cost you the harvest, meaning you will starve this winter regardless of who won the crown. Feudalism is a system where the protection you pay for with your labor often fails to protect you and then demands you die for its failures. And yet there is a dark allure to it. For a brief moment, you traveled further than your grandfather ever did. You saw a castle in France or a walled city in Flanders. You saw wealth you couldn't comprehend. You might have even snagged a silver cup or a silk ribbon in the chaos of a sack. You tucked that small treasure into your tunic, a reminder that the world is bigger, richer, and crueler than your village. But getting to those distant lands wasn't a scenic tour. If you think your commute is bad, or that airport security is a hassle, you are unprepared for the sheer misery of medieval travel. You've survived the battle, but now you have to get home. And the road itself is trying to kill you. You step off the village path and onto what is laughably called the King's Highway. If you are imagining a paved, Roman-style road or even a flat dirt track, erase that image immediately. In the Middle Ages, a road is often just a legal concept, a right-of-way rather than a physical reality. It is a muddy scar across the landscape, churned into a quagmire by ox carts, hooves, and feet. The mainstream historical fact here is the existence of holloways. Over centuries of traffic, the soft earth was worn down so deeply that the road sank below the level of the surrounding fields, sometimes by 10 or 20 feet. You are walking in a tunnel of earth and tree roots, a damp, dark trench that turns into a rushing river when it rains. In the summer, the mud dries into rock-hard ruts that can snap a wagon axle or your ankle in seconds. Navigating this terrain is less like hiking and more like an obstacle course. Travel speed is excruciatingly slow. If you are walking, which, let's be honest, you are, you might cover 15 to 20 miles a day. If you have an ox cart, cut that in half. A journey of 50 miles, which takes us less than an hour today, is a 3 to 4 day expedition requiring logistical planning and prayer. You are stuck in a localized bubble. Going to the next county feels like international travel. Now, let's talk about infrastructure. Who fixes these roads? Theoretically, the local manor or parish is responsible for trinoda necessitas, the three duties of bridge repair, road repair, and fortification. In practice, nobody wants to do it. It's backbreaking, unpaid work. So you encounter bridges that are rotting, washed out, or simply non-existent. This brings us to a quirky, surprisingly pious tidbit, the bridge hermit. Because maintaining bridges was seen as a charitable religious act, helping travelers was a corporal work of mercy. Hermits would often set up residence right on, or next to a bridge. They would live in a tiny cell, collect tolls or alms from travelers, and use the money and their own labor to repair the structure. The infrastructure department wasn't government-run. It was run by a guy with a long beard who wanted to suffer for God. Next time you pay a bridge toll, just be glad you don't have to listen to a sermon first. Here's a light joke for the commuters. Why did the medieval traveler cross the road? To get to the other side. Eventually, assuming the mud didn't swallow him whole, and the bridge was then washed away by a light drizzle. But the physical state of the road is the least of your worries. The real terror is who else is on it. The roads, especially those passing through the waste, forests, or heathlands, are the hunting grounds of outlaws. These aren't the dashing Robin Hood types who redistribute wealth. These are desperate, violent men who have been declared caput lupinum, wolf's head. This legal term meant they were no longer considered human in the eyes of the law. They could be killed on sight by anyone, just like a wolf. Because they had nothing to lose, their violence was extreme. Travel was so dangerous that people would wait days to form a caravan with other travelers for safety in numbers before crossing a particularly notorious stretch of woods. Historians still argue whether the concept of the king's peace, the idea that the monarch's protection extended to all main roads, was an effective deterrent or merely legal fiction. Did the threat of hanging actually stop bandits? Or was the medieval countryside essentially a Wild West, where local lords and robber barons did whatever they pleased until the king's army showed up? The prevalence of fortified manor houses suggests that people didn't trust the peace very much. When night falls, you need shelter. You can't just pitch a tent by the road, too dangerous. You look for an inn or an alehouse, usually marked by a bundle of evergreen boughs, an ale stake, sticking out above the door. But don't expect a private room with a mint on the pillow. You pay for a spot in a bed you will likely share with 2 or 3 strangers. You sleep with your money pouch tied around your groin and a dagger under your hand. The mattress is straw, the sheets are gray, and the bed bugs are aggressive. A hostler might be in league with the local bandits, tipping them off about which guest has a heavy purse. Here's a light joke for the Yelp reviewers. The traveler asks the innkeeper, "Does this bed have fleas?" The innkeeper replies, "No, sir, not a single one. They're all married with large families." The danger of travel profoundly shaped the medieval mind. It made the world feel vast, hostile, and unknown. Maps were rare and symbolic, mappa mundi, showing Jerusalem at the center and dragons at the edges, rather than useful navigational tools. You navigated by landmarks, word of mouth, and the position of the sun. Getting lost wasn't an inconvenience. It was a survival situation. And yet, people did travel. Pilgrims, merchants, messengers, and soldiers clogged these muddy arteries. There was a vibrancy to the road, a mixing of classes and dialects that you couldn't find in the village. You might meet a pardoner selling fake relics, a juggler, or a messenger carrying a royal writ. The road was the internet of the Middle Ages, the only place where information flowed, however slowly. One specific danger you have to watch out for is the barrier of language. Travel just 50 miles, and the dialect changes so much you might barely understand the locals. There is a famous account by William Caxton of a merchant asking for eggs, northern dialect, and the farm wife saying she doesn't speak French because she calls them Erin, southern dialect. You could starve simply because you don't know the local word for bread. As you trudge along, dodging a pothole large enough to drown a pig, you see a strange sight ahead. A group of people gathered around a twisted tree, leaving small offerings of flowers and cloth. You realize that while the king claims the road and the church claims your soul, there are older, deeper forces at work in the countryside. The sun is setting, the shadows are stretching, and the rational world is fading away. It is time to talk about the things that go bump in the night and why you are absolutely terrified of them. You hurry past the twisted tree, making the sign of the cross, not because you are particularly devout in this moment, but because you are terrified. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and in the medieval mind, the world changes the instant the light fails. The physical dangers of bandits and potholes are replaced by threats that are far more insidious because they are invisible. You are now walking through a landscape that is thick with magic, spirits, and hidden forces. The mainstream historical fact here is the prevalence of syncretism. While the church was the dominant spiritual authority, the average person practiced a blend of Orthodox Christianity and ancient pre-Christian folklore. You didn't see a contradiction between praying to St. Christopher for safe travel and leaving a bowl of milk out for the good neighbors, fairies, to keep them from curdling your cream. Religion was the high-level operating system, but superstition was the day-to-day app you used to navigate life's glitches. To you, the world is not governed by the laws of physics or biology. It is governed by intent. If your cow stops getting milk, it's not a dietary issue. It's because a neighbor looked at her with an evil eye. If you have a sudden sharp pain in your side, you haven't pulled a muscle. You have been elf-shot, struck by an invisible arrow fired by a malicious sprite. The woods aren't just trees. They are the domain of creatures who view humans as intruders or playthings. This brings us to a quirky, tangible tidbit: apotropaic marks. If you look closely at the timber beams of medieval barns, churches, or even the hearth of your own hut, you might see strange carvings. Compass-drawn circles, daisy wheels, intersecting V's, Marian marks invoking the Virgin Mary, or burn marks deliberately made with a candle. These weren't graffiti. They were spiritual security systems. They were carved to trap demons or witches in the endless lines of the geometry, preventing them from entering the home through the weak points like chimneys, doors, and windows. You literally etched your fear into the architecture of your house. Here's a light joke for the skeptics. Why did the medieval peasant carry a piece of iron in his pocket? To repel fairies, and also to weigh himself down so the wind didn't blow him away. He was very malnourished. The people you turned to for help with these supernatural problems weren't always priests. They were the cunning folk or white witches. These were local community members who provided magical services, finding lost spoons, identifying thieves, curing toothaches, and creating love potions. They were an essential part of the village economy. You paid the priest to save your soul, but you paid the cunning woman to save your pig. The church often turned a blind eye to this low magic, as long as it didn't veer into heresy, realizing that they couldn't police every charm whispered over a sick child. Let's talk about those charms. Many were bizarre mix-ups of Latin liturgy and gibberish. You might recite the Lord's Prayer backwards to stop a fire, or write the names of the three wise men, Casper, Melchior, Balthasar, on a piece of parchment and swallow it to cure a fever. The written word itself was seen as magical. If a priest wore a text around his neck, it was holy. If you did it, it was a talisman. The line was blurry, and you walked it every day. But the entities you feared weren't the cute, glittery fairies of Victorian storybooks. Medieval fairies, or the Fae, were terrifying, amoral, human-sized entities that lived in parallel mounds. They would steal human babies, leaving changelings, lure travelers off the path to their deaths, or blight crops just for fun. They were like supernatural sociopaths. You never called them fairies. That was too direct and might summon them. You called them the gentry or the little people to be polite. Your relationship with the supernatural was like living next to a violent, unpredictable neighbor. You kept your head down, followed the rules, and offered gifts to keep the peace. Historians still argue about the timing and intensity of the witch hunts. While we associate burning witches with the Dark Ages, the mainstream academic consensus is that the mass hysteria. Here's a light joke for the coven. Two witches are arguing. One says, "I put a hex on the baker." The other says, "Why?" The first replies, "He kept giving me shortbread." I apologize. The puns are the only things that aren't grim here. This magical worldview served a psychological function. It explained the unexplainable. In a world where death was random and sudden, as we saw with the plague, believing that it was caused by a witch or a fairy gave you a target. It meant there was a cause, and if there is a cause, theoretically, there is a solution. It provided a false sense of control in a chaotic existence. You weren't helpless against a virus. You were fighting a spiritual battle, and you had weapons, holy water, iron, salt, and prayer. The church, for its part, tried to channel this need for magic into authorized avenues. The cult of saints was essentially a sanctioned system of supernatural patronage. You visited a shrine, touched a relic, a bone, or a piece of clothing of a saint, and expected a miracle. The fluid from the tomb of St. Thomas Becket was said to cure blindness. These relics were the nuclear batteries of spiritual power. If your village church had a good relic, it brought in pilgrims and money, boosting the local economy. It was spiritual tourism. But as you stand before your door, tracing the V mark carved into the wood for protection, you feel the weight of the night pressing in. The darkness is absolute. There is no light pollution, no street lamps. The night belongs to the things that hunt. You hurry inside, bolting the door not just against thieves, but against the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of hunters said to ride across the sky, sweeping up souls. You are safe inside your smoky, smelly hut, but the world outside is teeming with invisible eyes. And this fear of the environment, of the very air you breathe, and the ground you walk on, extends to the places where people congregate. You might think the countryside is scary, but wait until you smell the city. We are leaving the village now to visit the hub of commerce, culture, and concentrated filth. Prepare your nose. We are going to town. You leave the haunted woods behind and see the stone walls of a city rising in the distance, maybe London, Paris, or York. You think you've reached civilization, a place of safety and opportunity. But as you pass through the heavy gates, overseen by guards who look at you with deep suspicion, you realize you've just traded one kind of hell for another. If the village was a slow rot, the medieval city is a pressure cooker of filth, noise, and chaos. The first thing that hits you is the wall of sound. In the village, the loudest thing was a cow in distress. Here the air is shredded by the clatter of iron-shod cartwheels on cobblestones. If you're lucky enough to be on a paved street, the yelling of hawkers selling everything from hot pies to eels, and the constant jarring ringing of church bells, marking the canonical hours. It is an assault on the ears that never truly stops. But the sound is nothing compared to the smell. The mainstream historical fact about medieval urban life is the phenomenon known as the urban graveyard effect. For most of the Middle Ages, cities were demographic sinkholes. The death rate within the city walls consistently exceeded the birth rate. The sanitation was so poor, the disease transmission so rapid, and the violence so common that the city population could only be maintained by a constant stream of hopeful immigrants, like you pouring in from the countryside. You are fresh fuel for a machine that grinds people up. You try to walk down the main street, but it feels like you've entered a canyon. This is due to a distinctive architectural feature called jettying. To maximize floor space on small, expensive plots of land, builders would cantilever the upper stories out over the street. The second floor hangs over the first, and the third over the second. In narrow lanes, the houses on opposite sides might almost touch at the top, blocking out the sun completely. You are walking in a perpetual, gloomy twilight, even at noon. This lack of sunlight prevents the mud and waste below from ever drying out, keeping the street in a permanent state of slime. And let's talk about that slime. In the center of the street runs the kennel and open gutter. There are no underground sewers. This channel is the destination for everything: rainwater, wash water, butcher's offal, and the contents of the thousands of chamber pots emptied every morning. If the gradient is steep and it rains hard, it flushes away. If it's flat and dry ... festers. You are literally walking next to an open septic tank. Here's a quirky practical tidbit. To navigate this muck without ruining their shoes, city dwellers wore pattens. These were wooden soles raised on iron rings or wooden blocks strapped over your normal leather shoes. They effectively acted as mini stilts, elevating your feet a few inches above the sludge. The clinking sound of pattens on stone was the background soundtrack of the medieval city. Without them, you are bringing the street into your house with every step. The zoning laws of the time or lack thereof add to the sensory nightmare. The shambles, the butcher's quarter, is right there in the mix. Animals are slaughtered on sight. Blood runs into the kennel. Entrails are sometimes tossed into the river or piled in, dung heaps that grow terrifyingly large before being carted away. Then there are the tanners, who use urine and dog feces to cure leather. The ammonia stench is eye-watering. The city is a patchwork of industrial pollution and residential crowding. Here is a light joke for the urban planners. Why was the medieval city street so confused? Because it was full of twists and turns, and most of them led to a dead end or a dunghill. Also, street names were literal. Stinking Lane and Gropekant Lane were real places. Advertising, exactly what you found there. Historians still argue about the extent of the filth narrative. While Victorian historians love to depict medieval cities as unmitigated cesspools, newer research into court rolls shows that city councils actually passed endless ordinances fining people for littering, dumping waste, or letting pigs roam free. The argument is, if they were constantly fining people, it means the streets were dirty. But it also means they cared and were trying to fix it. Was it a losing battle or a regulated struggle? The truth is likely that it smelled bad, but perhaps not quite as apocalyptic as we imagine, unless you were downwind of the tannery. The crowding is intimate and aggressive. In the village, you had space. Here, families are packed into single rooms and tenements. The walls are thin. You hear your neighbors fighting, loving, and dying. Fires are a constant, terrifying threat. With timber houses, thatched roofs, though many cities tried to ban thatch, and open hearths, a spark could turn a neighborhood into an inferno in minutes. When the curfew bell rings at night from the French couvre-feu cover the fire, it isn't just a suggestion. It is a mandatory safety order to bank your hearths and sleep in the cold to prevent the city from burning down. Water is a commodity. You can't just go to the stream. You have to buy water from water carriers, who haul it from public conduits or the river, which, remember, is also the sewer. Or you might rely on beer, even more heavily here than in the country. The beer consumption in cities was astronomical. There is also the human danger. Cities had curfews and chains. At night, heavy iron chains were often strung across the ends of streets to prevent horses and mobs from charging through. If you were found wandering after dark, without a light and a good reason, you were arrested. The night watch patrolled, but they were often just citizens doing mandatory duty, tired and easily bribed. The city at night was a labyrinth of shadows, where a cutpurse could slice your belt or your throat and vanish into the rookeries. And yet, despite the stench, the noise, and the danger, you stay. Why? Because of the German proverb, Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes you free. If a serf could escape his lord and live in a city for a year and a day without being caught, he became a free man. The city was the engine of liberty, fueled by the desperation of people like you, running from the feudal grind. But freedom has a price. In the village, you are poor, but you had a support network of kin. Here, you are anonymous. If you starve alone in a doorway. And as you look at the merchants in their velvet, passing you on their high horses, literally, you realize that the feudal hierarchy hasn't disappeared. It's just changed shape. It's now based on coin. And to survive here, you need money. Lots of it, and the authorities have invented a million ways to take it from you. You might think that after surviving the plague, the bandits, and the terrifying medical care, you've earned the right to keep what little you produce. But in the medieval world, your wallet has a hole in it, and that hole is legally mandated by both God and the government. If you thought modern taxes were complicated, welcome to the web of feudal extraction, where you are charged for breathing, working, and even dying. The mainstream historical fact that dominates your economic life is the tithe. This wasn't a voluntary donation to the collection plate. It was a non-negotiable tax of 10% on everything you produced, payable to the church. And I mean everything. You owe 1 sheaf of wheat out of every 10, 1 lamb out of every 10, 1 bucket of milk out of every 10. This was the great tithe. Then there was the little tithe on your garden produce, your geese, and even your wages if you were a laborer. The collection was ruthless. The parsonage men would come to your field and mark every 10th bundle of grain before you could even touch your share. These goods were stored in massive, tithe barns, often the largest, best-built structures in the village, standing as a physical reminder of where the wealth was going. You are literally taking food out of your children, as mouths to pay for the priest's candles, and the bishop has wine. If you tried to cheat, say, by hiding the best wool and offering the scrappy stuff, you were just fined. You were threatened with excommunication. You were robbing God, and the penalty was eternal fire. Here is a light joke for the accountants. Why did the medieval peasants stop counting his chickens? Because he knew the priest would just take the one that hatched first anyway. But the church was just the beginning. The lord of the manor had a dozen different ways to nickel and dime you. One of the most hated was multure. You were legally required to grind your grain at the lord's mill. You couldn't just do it at home with a handstone, a quern. That was illegal. The lord's miller would take a toll of the flour, often a generous scoop as payment. Millers were universally hated and suspected of having golden thumbs, pressing down on the scale or taking too much. If the bailiff found a hand quern in your house, he would smash it. You were a captive customer in a monopoly market. Then there was tallage. This was a tax that the lord could levy on his unfree serfs essentially, whenever he felt like it, usually when he needed to pay for a war or a daughter's dowry. It was arbitrary. You couldn't budget for it. You just had to hope the lord didn't have expensive taste in armor. Now for the quirky, truly depressing tidbit. Harriet. This is the tax on death. When a tenant farmer died, the lord was entitled to claim his best beast. Remember that cow we talked about in Section 8? The one that kept you warm and gave you milk? If your father dies, the lord's bailiff walks in and takes that cow. But wait, it gets worse. The church often claimed the second best beast as a mortuary fee, a payment to cover any tithes the deceased might have forgotten to pay while alive. So, in the moment of your family's greatest grief, you also lose your 2 most valuable economic assets. You are left with a corpse and an empty barn. Here's a light joke for the estate planners. The peasant says to his son, "I'm leaving you everything I own." The son asks, "What is it?" The peasant replies, "A debt to the miller and a very angry goat that the Lord refused to take." Historians still argue whether the total tax burden on a medieval peasant estimated by some to be around 30% to 50% of their gross production was actually higher or lower than what a modern worker pays in income tax, VAT, and Social Security. The difference, of course, is the surplus. A modern worker paying 40% still has money for Netflix and food. A medieval peasant paying 40% might starve to death in a bad winter. It wasn't the percentage. It was the margin of survival. Because there was very little actual coin in circulation, silver pennies were rare and valuable. Most of this debt and taxation was handled through barter or credit. This brings us to tally sticks. These were willow sticks marked with notches to represent the debt. The stick was then split down the middle. The creditor kept one half, the stock, and the debtor kept the other, the foil. When it was time to settle up, the two halves were matched together to prove no one had added extra notches. It was a physical, tamper-proof credit card. The British government actually used these until 1826. In fact, burning the old tally sticks in 1834 accidentally set the Houses of Parliament on fire, a final act of revenge by the medieval accounting system. You live your life in a perpetual state of owing someone something. You owe labor to the Lord, week work. You owe corn to the priest. You owe a chicken to the neighbor who helped you fix your roof. This web of obligation is what holds society together, but it also traps you. You can't just pack up and leave because your debts and your unfree status are tied to the soil. And what happens if you can't pay? You don't declare bankruptcy. You might be fined, put in the stocks, or your land might be seized. The fear of falling into destitution is constant. The poor in the Middle Ages weren't just those with less money. They were the deserving poor, widows, the disabled, who were allowed to beg, and the undeserving poor, able-bodied men out of work, who were treated as criminals. There was no safety net other than the charity of the parish, which was often just enough to keep you alive to suffer another day. Here's a light joke for the bankers. Why did the peasant invest in mud? Because it was the only thing with a liquid asset that kept coming back. Terrible, I know, but financial humor is dry. As you sit at your table, carving a notch into a piece of wood to remind yourself that you owe the blacksmith for a nail, you look at your hands. They are calloused, scarred, and dirty. You have worked every day since you were 5 years old. You have survived famine, plague, and war. You have paid your tithes and your taxes. And for what? To keep the cycle going for one more generation. But the cycle is winding down for you. The aches in your joints are getting worse. The cough from the smoke is deeper. You are considered an old man or old woman, even though you might only be 45. The brutal arithmetic of the medieval world is catching up. It is time to look at the finish line, the final section of our journey where we sum up this short, sharp, and shocking existence. You pause by the water trough to splash your face, catching a glimpse of your reflection in the stillness before the ripples break it apart. The face staring back at you is a map of every hardship we've discussed. You are perhaps 45 years old, but in our modern world, you would pass for a hard-lived 70. Your skin is leathery and deeply creased from decades of exposure to the sun and wind. Your hairline has retreated, likely aided by the constant friction of a wool coif or the stress of that last famine. When you smile, if you have the energy to smile, it reveals a gap-toothed landscape. Sugar wasn't the enemy here. It was too expensive. It was the grit in the stone-ground bread that ground your molars down to smooth, painful stumps. The mainstream historical fact regarding your lifespan is a number often misunderstood: 35 years. That is the average life expectancy, often cited for the Middle Ages. But don't panic. This doesn't mean everyone dropped dead on their 35th birthday like a timer went off. This number is heavily skewed by the horrific infant mortality we witnessed in Section 10. If you managed to survive the gauntlet of childhood, the measles, and the first few harvest cycles, you actually had a decent chance of reaching your 50s or even early 60s. However, the quality of those later years was vastly different. By 50, your body is essentially a wrecked machine. Your joints scream with osteoarthritis, a direct result of the repetitive, heavy lifting we detailed. Your lungs are scarred from the indoor smoke of the open hearth. You likely carry the marks of at least one serious injury, a poorly set bone from a fall, or a jagged scar from a tool slip. You are a survivor, but you are carrying the weight of survival in every step. Here is a light joke for the seniors. You know you a medieval elder when your midlife crisis isn't buying a sports car. It's buying a slightly lighter hoe because your back can't take the heavy one anymore. Now for a quirky, macabre tidbit about what happens when the end finally comes. The charnel house, because consecrated ground in the churchyard was limited and valuable. You didn't get to rest in peace forever. After a few years, when your flesh had decayed, the sexton would dig up your bones to make room for a fresh corpse. Your skull and long bones would be stacked neatly in a crypt or a special shed called a charnel house. It was a communal afterlife. You lived in a crowded hut, you slept in a crowded bed, and you will spend eternity in a crowded stack of femurs. The concept of eternal privacy was as foreign as a smartphone. Historians still argue vigorously about the Merry England thesis. Was medieval life purely a misery parade of mud and plague? Or was there a deep communal joy that we have lost? Some argue that despite the hardship, the medieval peasant enjoyed more holidays, holy days, a stronger sense of community belonging, and a less anxious, more spiritually centered existence than the isolated, clock-watching modern worker. Were they happier than us, or just too tired to complain? Looking at your worn hands, you might vote for tired, but you also recall the taste of that ale at the harvest festival, the warmth of the fire, and the laughter of your children who did survive. It wasn't all darkness. But now, the shadows are lengthening for the final time. You feel a heaviness in your chest that has nothing to do with smoke. You lie down on your straw pallet, the same one you've slept on for years. The family gathers around. This is the ars moriendi, the art of dying. It is a public event. You are not whisked away to a sterile room. You are right here, in the center of the home. The priest is called to deliver the last rites, to shrive you of your sins, so you don't have to spend too long in purgatory. You make your final will, giving your soul to God, your body to the earth, and that one good cow to the Lord, because you have to. You look up at the blackened thatch of the roof, hearing the familiar rustle of the rats and the breathing of the livestock. It's a sensory tapestry that has been your entire world. The fear of hell is there, yes, but also a strange relief. The labor is done. The taxes are paid. The hunger is fading. You close your eyes, and the sounds of the village, the blacksmith's hammer, the church bell, the shouting of children begin to drift away, replaced by a silence that is deep and final. You have walked the muddy roads, endured the freezing winters, and survived a world that seemed designed to kill you. You are part of the vast, silent majority of history, the people who built the cathedrals but were never buried inside them. You were the grit, the muscle, and the endurance of the human race. And now you can rest. And just like that, we leave the smoke-filled hut behind. Take a deep breath now. Feel the air filling your lungs. It's clean, cool, and free of the heavy soot of the open hearth. Let the image of the muddy village street dissolve. The squealing of the pigs and the clatter of the cartwheels are fading into a soft, distant hum. You are not lying on a prickly straw sack shared with strangers. You are safe in your own space, supported by soft cushions and warm blankets. The drafty walls and the howling wind are gone, replaced by the steady, comforting security of your modern sanctuary. There are no bailiffs coming to the door, no bells demanding your labor, no fears of what the darkness holds. Feel the tension leaving your shoulders, the ache of the phantom hard labor melting out of your muscles. You don't have to worry about the harvest or the winter stores. You are warm. You are safe. You are at rest. The history is real, but it is in the past. It cannot touch you here. You can let go of the struggle and just be. The candle has burned down, the village is asleep, and the long, hard century is over. Let the quiet wrap around you like a soft, heavy quilt. Drift away from the mud and the noise. Everything is still. Everything is peaceful. Good night.